Okay, looks like we are live. Hi everyone. We are here with our next community conversation for today. And today we have a really exciting topic. We are talking about Bridgerton, everyone's new favorite show on Netflix. And more specifically, we are talking about relationships in Bridgerton, especially related to rape and sexual assault. Definitely a little bit of a trigger warning for anyone who's watching that we will be discussing those topics. But we're really excited to be talking with you all today about Bridgerton and the things that we saw in the show. I think we're all big fans. We'll jump into it in just a minute. But before we get started, I want to have some introductions for all of us. My name is Nicole Owens. I am a community educator at Denton County Friends of the Family, and I am joined by a couple of my coworkers, so I will let them introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Ariel. I am a residential advocate at Denton County Friends of the Family.
I'm Sarah Morley. I'm the youth engagement specialist at Denton County Friends of the Family, and I work alongside Nicole in the prevention department.
And my name is Leslie, and I'm an intern at Denton County Friends of the Family, just now joining for this semester.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. I know we're all really, really excited to talk about Bridgerton because we all watched the show and it's just some fun stuff to discuss. But today, like I said, we are talking about what's actually related to the work that we do. So we're talking about rape and sexual assault. Now, I know for some people, when we even bring up the idea of rape and sexual assault in Bridgerton, they're a little confused about what we're talking about. They're like, what scene? What rape scene? You say there's a rape scene. I don't even know what happened. We know that many people who watched Bridgerton didn't even realize that what they were watching depicted rape. So I want to start off by talking about what our definition of rape is, so that everyone knows what we're talking about, rape and sexual assault. How do we define that, and what does that look like for us at our agency? Anyone want to jump in?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So rape and sexual assault are kind of related, but they can look a little different. Oftentimes we use the phrase sexual assault to kind of be an umbrella term. So a bunch of different behaviors can fall under the banner of sexual assault. So it could be things like unwanted touching, sending explicit text messages that someone doesn't want to receive, anything like exhibitionism, so showing body parts that somebody doesn't want to see, all the way up to and including things like rape. So rape is an example of sexual assault, but not all sexual assault is going to be specifically the act of rape.
Mm-hmm. Okay, awesome. And I think one of the things when we're talking about rape is we're talking about sexual acts without consent, correct? Mm-hmm. So consent is needed for sex to occur. If we don't have consent, then it would fall into that category of rape, correct?
Correct, yeah. And when we talk about sexual assault as a whole, it's defined by this non-willing, non-consensual interaction. So somebody doesn't want that sexual attention or doesn't want that sexual contact. That would be kind of what we describe as in general as sexual assault, any unwanted, non-consensual, either attention or actions.
Excellent. So the scene specifically that we're talking about that depicts rape is with Simon and Daphne, two of the main characters in the show. And at the time in this scene, they are married, they are in a relationship. And we see at the start that Simon seems excited for the sexual acts that are going to occur, which seems like consent. It's not verbally discussed consent. We lack that almost in every TV show and movie, unfortunately. But I think that the TV show is trying to imply that there's consent, that he is enthusiastic and excited about what's going to happen. So that brings up the question of how is this rape then? If he is excited and willing to engage in having sex with Daphne, his wife, when does it become rape?
Well, I think we can answer that partially by talking about consent and providing a little bit more detail about what consent is. You know, consent is enthusiastic, it's not coerced, and it can be revoked at any time. And although there is a struggle with communication between almost every character throughout the entire series, Simon pretty clearly communicated his desires, and you can clearly tell that he is uncomfortable in that moment, and he did vocally express that, um, you know, through his body language and through his language, saying wait during that moment as well. So there is, if you're watching, a pretty clear line about when that changes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a real clear like moment in the scene happens where it starts to become like uncomfortable for Simon, and he starts to not only like physically kind of like something's wrong, I don't want this, but he says like kind of in a way like wait, or he kind of questions like what are you doing? And even though he's not like saying the words no, stop, I don't want this, everything about his body language, everything about his expression and like what's being communicated in that moment non-verbally says, I'm not okay with this, I don't want this. And then of course, what we kind of find out over the course after this incident occurs was that Daphne, that was her intention to do something that he did not want sexually. That was her intention the whole time, was to kind of corner him into doing something that he was not comfortable with, which of course is that, you know, sexual assault part of it. She knew that she was going to do something that he was not going to like, but she went ahead and did it anyways, regardless of whether he felt uncomfortable with it or even wanted it in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. So that point when Simon says like wait, you can see that he's uncomfortable, and that what's going on is that you know, Daphne is has discovered that he is part of the reason, like he's choosing for her not to get pregnant or have a child with her, and she wants to change that. So she clearly knows that this is not what he wants, that this is not his goal, and she continues on. Um, I think a really interesting thing that we want to discuss there, though, is our body and how our bodies respond. So some people might say, like, it seems or it appears that he, you know, like finishes in sex. He you know, has some kind of orgasm. He seems aroused. So why can't we rely on someone's body and what it's doing as an indicator of consent?
I'm glad you brought that up. I didn't read the book that this series was based off of. I understand it's based off the book The Duke and I by author Julia Quinn. It was published, I think, in the year 2000. I heard that this scene is in the book, although it involves some different details. Like Simon is very drunk, and it's a spur of the moment decision on Daphne's part, and she does it because she figures out, you know, that he could have children, and you're right. She recognizes that it's something he didn't want, but she decided that his reasons don't matter, and she's going to try to get pregnant anyway by any means necessary. Although the body did respond to sexual contact, absolutely. Responses like that are not consent. Responses like that in bodies, they can just be that, a response to contact, something that's more automatic, but it certainly doesn't indicate consent or even pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. So our body showing signs of like arousal does not equal consent. It needs to be that like informed, freely given, reversible, verbal consent for it to happen. Sarah, I know you also brought up earlier that he doesn't say no. He specifically, I think, says wait. And he asked, I think, at some point, what are you doing or what have you done? But he doesn't tell her fully to like stop or no. Um, and I think that comes into question with like people talk about responses. Like he didn't say no, he didn't say stop. So like, does that mean that it's okay for her to continue? What other kinds of responses might we see in people when they are experiencing or have experienced a sexual assault or rape?
Yeah, so responses can kind of vary widely depending on the individual experience and who that person is. In this kind of unique situation, we talk about Bridgerton, we're specifically talking about sexual assault within the context of a marriage. And those kinds of reactions might look differently than maybe those who are not married. So there's a certain level of comfortability that before this incident, Daphne and Simon had kind of developed with each other. There was a level of trust, of companionship, of all those things that, we would see in quote unquote a healthy relationship. But there's still also this power dynamic going on. And so I think, of course, I'm not Simon, I'm not his character, I don't know. But for me, like, I kind of read it as confusion and like really kind of like being taken aback, being surprised by what was happening. I'm not sure that he would have defined it as a sexual assault, and we could talk about that later based on societal standards and whatnot. But some people may not say like, no, stop, I do not want this. Some people might be more confused, taken aback by what their partner's doing them, especially if it's the betrayal of that trust. Some people might freeze up and like not know what to say. Like, I don't know what's going on. I'm kind of panicking in the moment. I don't know what to do. Some people might try and like physically pull themselves away. They don't want it. They're trying to recoil. Responses can vary. And sometimes just because no wasn't said doesn't mean that there wasn't communication, that this wasn't wanted. Consent is always a like clear communication, right? And if somebody goes, wait, they're telling you, wait, stop. Kind of that stop is inferred, is it implied? And so I think it's important to like acknowledge that, just because you don't say stop doesn't mean that it's full steam ahead, we're good to go, right? There always needs to be checking up with the other person, making sure that they're okay and that you're okay. Constant communication, that's a part of consent. It's not just a strict yes or a strict no, and then that's it, we're done. It's kind of this continual checking up and continual communication. And clearly when Simon said stop or said wait, he was trying to communicate his discomfort, but Daphne, very clearly chose to ignore that. She made a very clear choice that says, know what, I'm in charge here and I'm not listening to you, even though I know it's gonna hurt you and even though I know you certainly don't want this. So reactions to a sexual assault can vary. It might be a no, it might be a wait, it might be a I'm not sure about this, I'm uncomfortable, it might be a freeze moment, but still all of that is still something that has to be taken into account during. If you see your partner freeze up and lock up, time to ask a question, are you okay, right? If you see your partner kind of be, I'm not sure about this, check in with your partner, are you okay, do you want to stop? Like, that's when communication needs to happen in a sexual consensual relationship, which in this case it was not.
Yeah, I think that's so important for us to acknowledge. I think we assume that a response, if someone is being sexually assaulted or raped, that everyone's response will be to fight. But that's just not the case. We know that people have different responses to circumstances. Some people do fight, and that's a valid response, but some people will freeze up. Some people don't know what to do. Some people will just, shut down until they can get through it. And those are valid responses as well. But when we tie that together, this expectation that someone will fight, with also sort of these like non-voluntary body signals, that can create a lot of shame and guilt and blame for the person who was victimized. So it's important that we can recognize that to help alleviate or get rid of that shame and guilt. Another plot that we see in Bridgerton, not involving Daphne and Simon, we see another character, Marina, and Colin. And Marina is pregnant out of wedlock, which is a huge scandal in the Regency era. And, you know, she has to find some solution or she'll be ruined for the rest of her life. So this Colin is attracted to her, and she creates sort of a plot or a plan to try to pass the baby off as his baby. So would this be, and she's not successful in her attempt to get him to have sex with her, but what are other types of examples of like sexual assault or rape that we not just see in Bridgerton, but just in life in general? I think you mentioned a few earlier, Sarah, but what are some things that people might not consider or think about?
I think guilt tripping is a huge thing that we see in this day and age. While we might not see, you know, that out of wedlock kind of conversation happening these days, we definitely see a lot of people that will use like, oh, well, if you loved me, then you would sleep with me, or even maybe more severe circumstances. You know, if I will not give you X, Y, or Z, like some abusive partners may say, I might not let you see the kids, or I might hit you, or you will receive some sort of punishment if you do not sleep with me. And I feel like that comes in a lot with the clients that we see, and it's scary to picture anyone going through that situation. And I think that also ties back into what we were talking about previously, where that traumatic response, you may not think of anything but, oh, I will maybe not going to get to see my kids, so therefore I must do what he says.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. It's that coercion, even though it may not be like physically forced, like I'm physically holding you down with my body. There's still this idea of like a consequence. If you don't do what I want you to do, there will be a very negative consequence for you that may be difficult to live with. And so that is not a free choice that is freely made. That is a choice that is forced. Somebody's forced to make that choice. And so sexual assault, as I kind of said earlier, and as we've been saying, is not something that's necessarily like as I said, like it's a forced activity, it's unwanted sexual attention and unwanted sexual anything, right? So even if someone's not like forcing you to have sex, that coercion, that not giving you a choice to freely make, that is not consent. And so any interactions that happen after that cannot be defined as consensual.
Mm-hmm.
And I think kind of going off what Leslie was saying, like guilt tripping is a big one. Sometimes I work a lot with younger adults, teens, and they talk about, you know, well, everybody else is kind of doing it. Why don't you do X, Y, or Z? We see a lot of kind of this justification of also like sexting. So sending pictures of somebody's body parts to somebody else and that being a really big deal. Some people may not think of like sexting as a form of sexual assault, but it is if the person on the other end does not want to receive that picture. If someone just randomly sends somebody a picture of their body, the other person on the receiving end can't consent to seeing that picture because it just pops up on their phone. So that's like an example of sexual assault, but also another example of sexual assault could be like sabotaging birth control. So whether it be like puncturing condoms or like making birth control like useless or ineffective, that might be a really covert, a really sneaky way of causing a major upheaval in someone's life. And if their birth control that they think they're using is not effective, then they're not consenting to that situation because they don't have all the knowledge of what's going to happen or what the consequences might be.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. And that kind of sabotaging birth control, that reproductive coercion, it is really common. There's even a name for like removing a condom mid-sex, stealthing. Certainly that does happen to quite a few people. The scene with Marina and the Bridgerton brother, whose name escapes me at this moment, where she kind of brings him into a room alone. I think there's also some interesting conversations that can be had around gendered expectations in that moment. She kind of expects him, you know, because he's a young man, that he's not going to say no. I think she says something in that scene like, well, you followed me in here. Why else did you follow me in here for? And he's like, well, you said you were not feeling well, so I was checking on you. There was an expectation that, of course, if she got him alone, he wouldn't say no because, young men are all like this. And she tried to kind of press on despite his discomfort, his clear physical, vocal discomfort. Because, like you mentioned, she did have her own agenda. And we can potentially talk a little bit more about the survival strategies that women have had to use throughout history in order not to become kind of despondent, in order to stay alive. But still, there's another, at the end of the scene with Daphne and Simon, the narrator's voice comes on and says something like, do these wretched means justify the ends? Of course not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's such a good point too. I mean, we see sort of Colin is the Bridgerton brother that's targeted by Marina, and Simon obviously is Daphne's victim. And of course, a lot of people watch these scenes like we talked about without recognizing that it was sexual assault or rape. But if the roles had been reversed, would people have recognized it? And I think maybe if they didn't even recognize it as rape or sexual assault, we would certainly have a lot more conversations around like, ooh, Colin was really creepy towards Marina there, or Simon was really out of line with Daphne. But I think there's some of these myths, which is what I want to get into next, around rape and sexual assault. And when it comes to gender, there's a lot of myth that happens with rape and sexual assault. So in general, I want to talk about how rape and sexual assault differ in the show from some of our common myths and beliefs about rape and sexual assault. So I guess gender, did you all have anything to add about that, where we see these men as victims in rape and sexual assault within this show?
So I really think that in this time frame that we are, there definitely needs to be continued conversation about women and rape, but even less so have we progressed from that era to now when we're talking about men and rape. Men are supposed to be manly. They have these societal expectations that wouldn't happen to them. If a woman is sexually assaulted, people might be more understanding of being like, oh, well, she couldn't fight him off. She was a woman, he was a man, she wasn't strong enough. But if a man gets raped, then that question is going to be like, oh, well, why didn't you just shove her off? Why didn't you just push her? Why didn't you just fight? Because you're a man, you're supposed to be able to do those things. And it goes back again, that trauma can really affect your responses. But there's so much stigmatizing conversations around men being raped, either by a woman or a man. Mm-hmm. There's just so much of yes, they're supposed to be manly, but also they're supposed to I lost my train of thought, but but there definitely needs to be that continued conversation, and I'm glad that we're doing something like this to be able to bring awareness to it.
Yeah, I really like what you said, Leslie. Like, it's this idea that, just because a man is sexually assaulted doesn't mean that like he's not a man and he doesn't have his own autonomy over his body. I think throughout the course of the show, which they actually talk about in a ton of different ways, is this concept of power and gender. What genders have power, what genders don't have power, and then how they utilize what they do have control over to affect their lives. Obviously, they try for the better. And so I think a lot in the show, they depict the men as the men are given a lot of, I'll say, liberties. They're given a lot of liberties in the show that the women are not. Women are expected to fit into a very small box of who they're supposed to be, how they're supposed to behave, how they're supposed to talk to each other, what they're supposed to be interested. Where men in the show get a little bit more breadth to kind of be themselves in whatever ways they want to be, whether it's like, I want to get married, I don't want to get married, I want to study this, I don't want to study that. Whereas women are kind of told, you are going to get married, you are going to have children, you are going to be a good wife. That is the gender script for you. And so I think in a sexual assault situation that we saw with Simon and Daphne, that kind of flips this whole idea of gender on its head, because we see a woman taking away Simon's power and control through sex, which is not something that generally women had control over. So it's this really interesting kind of dichotomy where we see these gender roles flipped. And I'm not sure what the author's response wanted what the author wanted the audience's response to be. I'm not sure I don't know if we were supposed to feel happy for Daphne in that moment or liberated. I certainly did not feel happy or liberated. I was kind of like, oh no, like we've now escalated somewhere that I did not anticipate this show going really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But there is kind of that stigma when we talk about like men being men, and men not wanting to be seen as weak or fragile or any of these other synonyms we commonly assign to women. I think that would definitely like play a role in how Simon conceptualized whether he was sexually assaulted or not. And I think just kind of based on the times, he would be hesitant, if even thought about calling it sexual assault. But nowadays we would of course say, yeah, like that's not okay.
Right.
And Sarah, you mentioned the author's reaction when the book was published. From what I understand, that scene that was also in the book was really kind of a subject of controversy as well. And the show Bridgerton made a lot of conscious changes to casting, to perhaps some of the plot, and certainly, although it takes place in the Regency area, they make a lot of decisions to change up different things about wardrobe, about slang, about how people speak to each other, perhaps even about some of the courtship rituals. But it is interesting that they decided to include kind of that really blatant power differential between gendered expectations. And I think that they could have made a choice not to include that scene as well. And it's quite interesting that they included it and then made the decisions around it that they did. Like, although Simon was sober and awake at the time, I think that one thing they tried to change in order to shift public perception about that scene in particular, they were working toward throughout the whole series. Part of that is casting with Daphne. You know, the actress is in her mid-20s, I think, but throughout the whole show, it seems as though they try to use her costumes to kind of conceal the fact that she's even gone through puberty. They really downplay, they try to make her look as young as possible with her makeup, with her hair, with her very kind of like drop waist costumes. They make her seem very small. And Simon himself, the character, the actor, he's also very muscular, quite a bit larger than her. And I think that race can also play a role as well in people not being able to recognize that this is a rape scene. And I think the show, you know, made those decisions in hopes that the scene wouldn't be recognized as it was in the book. But clearly people are still being able to identify problems with it. And I think that decisions around casting, around costuming, and around changing details of the scene, but not changing it completely, certainly deserve a lot more scrutiny. Deserve a lot more criticism.
Yeah, those are wonderful points. I have a couple statistics here about gender and sexual assault. So for women, we know that more than 2 in 5 women and nearly 1 in 5 men will experience sexual assault in their lifetime. So statistically, it is still much more likely that women will be a victim of sexual assault, but we far too often forget that men are included as well. So we know that men are victims of sexual assault. And we also know that individuals belonging to any racial or sexual minority groups experience sexual violence at higher rates. So, you know, the scene that we see in Bridgerton with Daphne and Simon might not be our typical idea of what rape or sexual assault looks like, but it happens. We know that this is a reality, that there are men like Simon who are victims of sexual assault. Um, what other sort of myths do we see almost debunked or kind of shown in the show Bridgerton about rape and sexual assault?
I think one of, I don't know if I would call it a myth necessarily, but I think one of the beliefs that people have is that, like, if a sexual assault occurs, like, that's the end of the relationship. It's done. People break up, they're gone, they're split apart forever, never see each other again. When in reality, a lot of times when we talk about relationships where there's violence, sexual assault isn't necessarily that breaking point of I can't do this anymore. That's often a common thing that happens within an abusive relationship over the course of time. And so one of the things that we see in Bridgerton is we see even after the sexual assault occurred, even after Daphne chose to sexually assault him, they still remain together. They still remain together as a couple. And that's not the end of their relationship. Their relationship isn't finished, because a lot of times in abusive relationships, that's not the end. That's just an event that happens again and again along other series of other things. And so I think that's kind of a myth that it kind of breaks, is that, when sexual assault happens, relationships over. But oftentimes women and men have to endure it over the course of that abusive relationship, often for a long period of time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you're right, the relationship didn't end and they didn't really continue to communicate about it. I think one thing that the show also didn't address very well is the fact that Simon did not want children, and it really doesn't matter why he didn't want them. And Daphne decided that his reasons weren't good enough, and so she decided that she was going to take it upon herself to change that without discussing it with him. And the show doesn't really explore that very well. They just kind of decide that, oh, Simon didn't want children, but who doesn't want children? That is a wild idea. They have a baby and everything is hunky dory from there on out. And these issues are not dealt with substantially. And you're right, the assaults in the relationship, clearly they send really bad messages, but that can also send quite a few bad messages as well, that babies fix things, or if you don't conform to these certain societal norms about the nuclear family, then you don't deserve to have your boundaries respected, or something must be wrong with you, or your decisions aren't valid.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's really important that we talk about, relationships and people reconciling or continuing a relationship. It's not our place to tell someone that the relationship has to end. I think we often get people who at our agency, or when they hear about our agency, are confused that, we'll work with people who are still in a relationship with the person who used violence against them. But I mean, our goal is to help keep someone safe. It's not to tell them that you have to end this relationship, or you can never speak to this person again. We just want them to have safety, and to provide any services that they need in order to help that happen.
Yeah, we're not going to take away their power and their control over their own choices like somebody might have taken it from them. We're not going to repeat those cycles of we're making this choice for you whether you like it or not. So we're not going to say someone, you need to get out, this is what we're going to do. Like, we're going to help them make the choices that they want to make. And I think that's one of the good things about our agency is we're not here to judge. We're not here to say this is what you're going to do. We're here to listen and help you accomplish your goals that you want on your own free will.
And one thing that I've learned throughout my time here, but also throughout just learning about this career, is that even though we may feel like, okay, well, I've studied this a really long time, or I've worked with all of these clients, or that sort of thing, really the one with the most knowledge is the client themselves. They know what's safe for them. And so they probably have a good reason for staying. They may feel like they are in danger, and they would be in more danger leaving than they would be staying. And that is their decision, and that they need to make, because we don't know what they've experienced. They can tell us, but sometimes they don't tell us everything. Or they're just leaving out how badly it affected them, either emotionally, physically, mentally. And so it's really up to them, because they know. And we may tell them to leave, and then, as some statistics show, when or most all show that when a woman leaves that abusive relationship, that's where she's at the most danger, because that man has, or that person has nothing left to lose. So there's no control left. So they might as well take that that legal action. And so we're doing everything that we can to prevent that from happening. And so if they feel like the best way to prevent that is to go back, then it's our job to let them and to help them do that safely.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to talk about one depiction of an assault or an attempted assault in the show that does line up with a lot of our sort of belief of what sexual assault or rape looks like. And that's a scene with Nigel Burbrook. He's an older man who pursues Daphne. And we see in one scene, he finds her alone in the dark at night at a party and attempts to assault her. And she reacts. Do you all remember how she reacted?
Mhm.
So she had more of a fight response. She hits him, knocks him out, and is able to defend herself. And I think that's something important to talk about too, because that's a form of resistive violence. Sometimes people are like, okay, well, this person assaulted them, but then they assaulted them back. Like, that's not okay. Do you all want to add anything about or talk about some resistive violence really quickly?
Yeah, it's true that although Bridgerton is an escapist kind of fantasy TV show, depictions like that can perpetuate certain myths about sexual assault that are ultimately harmful for survivors. One being that, if you didn't want it to happen, why didn't you fight back? It doesn't really acknowledge that freezing and fawning are also common and valid responses to being in a situation like that.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think
Yeah.
it's, oh yeah, go ahead,
Oh, no, I was
Sarah.
gonna say, when we talk about resistive violence, like a lot of it's about context and looking at who has the power and control in that situation. Daphne did not necessarily have the power and control. We have, Nigel Burbrook, who is aggressively pursuing her like throughout most of the beginning part of the show. And so in a sense, she felt like she was in danger, like she had no choice. And so not saying that resistive violence is the thing that we advocate for and we tell clients that's okay to do, but in a situation where she might not have felt like she had power and control, it's different than what Nigel was doing to her. Their assaults were not did not come from the same thing. They came from two different emotions. Nigel was, I want to have power and control, and Daphne's was more of a fear response, like, I don't know what to do, I'm panicking.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And that's important for us, I think, to recognize because, at the end of that scene, we see Nigel who has like a battered face. He's all bruised up and unconscious. And Daphne, appears physically fine. And sometimes people use that as an indicator of like, who's the victim? Well, this person looks like a victim because they were punched in the face. This person looks fine, so they clearly weren't a victim. And that's not really a great indicator because we know that the context there mattered. Daphne was in danger. She was about to be assaulted and she reacted to a very traumatic situation. So I think it's important for us and for other people to recognize as well that, hey, we need to pay attention to what happened here.
And it's true that abusers can weaponize that kind of reactive violence against the people they're targeting in order to try and keep power and control over them. Like perhaps, getting police involved, not acknowledging that it was self-defense or reactive violence because of, like you mentioned, because of those physical injuries that they might have sustained. Certainly, you're right. She was defending herself. It doesn't come from the same place, but it can lead to misconceptions about who is attempting to get power and control over who.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And even in the show, Nigel Burbrook, the guy who got punched in the face, he did try and weaponize that assault. At one point, he comes up later and he goes, if you don't marry me, I'm going to say that we were alone in the garden and like you're not going to be seen as like a suitable partner for someone because you're ruined because you were alone with another man without supervision. So in a sense, he does attempt to regain his power and control back by threatening her and saying like, I'm going to start saying things if you don't do what I want you to do. And so like we kind of see not necessarily how it would happen in necessarily today's society, but that was his attempt at weaponizing that assault and saying, I'm the victim, but you don't want me to do something that you wouldn't want,
Yeah. So I think Bridgerton also brings to light this idea of rape and assault in intimate relationships. Again, we have this idea of like Nigel, sort of an acquaintance or even a stranger in a dark alley at night, finds someone alone and assaults them. But what do we know about intimate partners and sexual assault and what that looks like typically?
Well, what we know is that most often somebody is sexually assaulted by somebody that they know, whether that be a partner, a former partner, a friend, a family member. Oftentimes it's not that stranger hiding out in the dark, waiting to prey on somebody. It's somebody that you are close to and that you know. This kind of Bridgerton kind of helps debunk that myth of sexual assaults oftentimes do exist in relationships where you know the person. They're not this scary individual hiding out in the shadows.
I think there tends to be this myth too that rape can't happen in a relationship where people are married or have had consensual sex in the past. Actually, it looks like it wasn't until 1994 that we got rid of marital rape exemptions in the state of Texas. So this probably is a myth that's persisting from then. But we know that it can happen within marriages and intimate relationships where people have consented previously.
And I think that kind of ties back to this idea of women being viewed as kind of a property. Like there's no reason for consent if you're not at the same level as me, like consent doesn't exist. And so I think, unfortunately, Texas took until the mid 1990s to decide that, somebody can be sexually assaulted in a marriage. But I think that kind of ties back from a long held idea about men's power over women and men's position over women.
Yeah, certainly it connects back to the idea of marriage is more of a property transaction if someone doesn't have their own autonomy under a marriage. I saw a statistic recently that indicated that that marital sexual assault occurs in 14% of total marriages. That is a huge number of marriages. And certainly that myth around assault, not being assault within a marriage keeps people from recognizing that they are survivors of this and keeps people from reaching out for help.
Yeah. It's this idea. I hear it all the time from people we work with. Like, we're married and it wasn't violent, so it's not rape. But we know that that's not true. It doesn't have to be a stranger or someone you don't know, and it doesn't have to be physically violent in the sense that I think people tend to imagine in order for this to be rape. But you all touched on another topic that I think is really interesting about the show, is that we see young women in Bridgerton, and particularly just this Regency era in general, don't have any or very, very little education around sex and reproduction. We see these grown women who are getting married, who don't even know how a woman becomes pregnant. And so that's one of the things we see with Daphne, is that even after she's married to Simon, she still doesn't understand the details of how someone becomes pregnant, which is sort of what leads into this assault later on. It doesn't excuse the behavior at all, but we see that she definitely feels deceived and betrayed by not knowing that by multiple people in her life. But I want to talk about how that can be harmful to people to not have education around sex and reproduction, how that lack of information can be weaponized against a person by an abusive partner.
Yeah, certainly. There is certainly a lack of sex education within Bridgerton, and a lack of sex education persists in many states in the United States, including Texas. And it makes me wonder, can consent really exist if you are not fully educated about what could potentially happen, to your body? What acts could potentially lead to certain things, or you don't even know the mechanics kind of going into a relationship where that is expected of you, regardless of your own personal desires. Um, Certainly, you can't really have true consent without full sexual education.
Yeah.
I do think there is a huge lack of education when it comes to sexual contact. I remember hearing a story once that this one girl contracted an STD from sexual contact, but she saw that, or she thought that because it was oral sex that nothing would happen, that she wasn't going to get any kind of diseases, which is completely false. So not only does lack of education may lead to a pregnancy that someone's not ready for, but it also may lead to, in some cases, life-threatening diseases that you're getting from someone, especially if you don't know what their sexual history has been like. And that's another issue that isn't talked about. Not only what all goes into sex, but also really knowing your partner's history of sex, and being able to get tested for those sorts of things so that we can minimize those kinds of dangers. And that's a great tool that we have nowadays. But if you don't know that it exists, then it can't help you.
Yeah, and I think, it's certainly Texas schools, I think, have a ways to go when it comes to like fully providing a comprehensive sex education course. But I think even just in like partnership with that, I think there needs to be courses about relationships, not necessarily specifically like sex, but how do you have a healthy relationship with somebody? How do you communicate? How do you problem solve? How do you talk to somebody? I think, even in like health classes, the sex education is very like anatomically, this is what happens, and then hormones happen, and then the fallopian tube, like it's very science, very textbook anatomy. Because I think there's kind of a discomfort around talking about how relationships and sex work together or don't work together. And so I think there needs to be also conversations in schools about how do you have a healthy relationship. I think when I was watching the show, especially in the kind of the beginning before this kind of sexual assault happened, I'm thinking like people need to talk to each other. Like if you all just talk to each other and said, this is what I want and this is what I don't want, this is what I'm concerned about, like the show would be an hour and a half long and we would have no show, we would have no 8-hour program. And I think that's kind of a common theme in a lot of TV we watch in general, but it's also a theme that is reflected in reality. People need to have open and honest conversations about this because it's important. If it's important to you, then in a healthy relationship, it should be important to your partner as well. And we want to make sure that communication stays open because vulnerability and communication are two really important parts of a healthy relationship.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're right, Sarah. Certainly, Bridgerton is not a model for healthy relationships at all. And Leslie, you bring up a good point about sexual history. I knew nothing about Bridgerton prior to starting the show. In fact, when I started watching, because of how basic the dialogue is and because of how they relied on such common tropes like lack of communication and because of the costuming and the bright colors of the scenes, I assumed it was a children's show. I assumed it was for tweens until the sex scenes started happening. And I said, oh, this is a show for adults. That made its lack of kind of giving seriousness to some of these topics even more blatant. And it shows the pullout method, kind of throughout the show after the marriage as a reliable form of birth control. And it indicates that, although Simon had slept with many other individuals in the past, presumably using the pull-out method, he didn't use appropriate protection. So it didn't seem, not in my memory, I don't think they even discussed risks of STIs or protection, or you're right, Leslie, the health impacts of potentially catching one of those STIs on your body.
And I hadn't even thought of this, but right when you said that, I was just thinking, oh, wait, didn't we actually, I was thinking if I'm wrong, see a scene where Simon was having sex with someone else before they were married? And so there is that possibility there. They are both not virgins. And so there could be technically some sort of contamination there. And thought of that, shouldn't say
I And I'm so glad you brought that up, Ariel. The pull-out method. I think it's, according to Planned Parenthood, probably about like 75% effective, which is definitely not 100%, right? And so imagine that situation, like if Daphne had become pregnant, which is a pretty good possibility if, they're very happily married, clearly at the beginning.
Mhm.
And so like that definitely wouldn't have been informed, would have been very surprising. Um, but yeah, I think we see that this lack of education, this lack of talking about sex can lead to things like unwanted pregnancy, STI, and a whole load of other things as well. Um, Sarah, I know, you and I go and talk at schools a lot. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like children and young people and how this lack of talking about sex or our bodies or consent can actually be dangerous to them.
Yeah, absolutely. So when generally we have these conversations like middle school, high schoolish, obviously because at elementary school, like there are other things that we need to focus on more than kind of this sexual relationship or consent in that kind of in phrasing in that way. And so when I go and talk to kids, I ask them kind of like about consent, what they think is consent, and they give me like very like basic answers that I would expect from them, like saying yes or no. And so I start actually talking to them about like, well, what about consent in relationships? So I kind of give them this hypothetical situation. I say, let's say you're dating someone for 2 days. Is it okay to kiss them, whenever you want to? And they're like, oh no, that's inappropriate, like too soon in a relationship. I'm like, okay, like, yeah. And I say, okay, well, what if you've been dating 2 weeks? And they're like, yeah, you still like shouldn't do that. You should, say something first. And I go, okay, what if you've been married for 2 years? Is it okay to kiss your partner whenever you want to? And they're like, yeah, sure. Like you're married, like that's what you do. And so I think there's this idea even among like young folks that just because you're comfortable with someone, that means that you consent with someone. That means that consent is already implied in the relationship. And that's not true. Consent is something that needs to be gotten each and every time. It's not something that just kind of you understand in a relationship. Like just because you're comfortable with someone and familiar with someone and trust someone doesn't mean that you still don't need that, like, yes, I am okay with this, or no, I don't want this. You still need to get consent from your partner, regardless of how long you've known each other or regardless of what kind of relationship you have with them. So I think there's kind of this idea that, kids think that marriage is kind of this free for all moment, like everyone's good and we're all happy all the time. And, I think like that's an important thing to talk about them with, is in relationships, even if you've been dating someone for years and years and years, you still have to get that consent because that's a really important part of a relationship. We never want to force somebody to do something that they don't want to do, regardless of whether you're in a relationship or not.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, and I was thinking too about those really young children when we go and talk to them. Obviously, we aren't talking to, kindergartners about consensual sexual relationships because that's so far in their future. But we still do talk to them about their bodies and boundaries and consent in other ways that are really important and help protect them from people who might prey on the vulnerability of not knowing about those things. So, if someone is preying on a young child, and this child doesn't know, like, hey, these are my private body parts, and you're not supposed to look at or touch my private body parts unless you're like a doctor or someone who's making sure I'm healthy or clean, then someone can manipulate that really easily. And so even with young children, we need to be having these conversations. They just look a little bit different than the conversations we're having with like middle schoolers and high schoolers, who are, starting some romantic relationships and all of those fun things.
Yeah, exactly. With we start as young as pre-K doing it's Bumbles, the magic bumblebee is what it's called. We wear a bumblebee suit, we do magic, and we basically teach them, there are safe touches and there are unsafe touches, and it's really important to talk to a safe adult if you ever get an unsafe touch, or if you don't know if a touch is safe or unsafe. And we kind of talk about that, and link it to this point of your body is your own, and it's okay to have your body. People don't own and control your body. You get to make decisions about it. So we start really young, even at pre-K, and we kind of build as they get older and as they get more mature and are able to understand more advanced concepts, and we kind of work our way up with the hope that, if we can teach young kids about their bodies and how it's theirs, and teach them about healthy relationships, we can prevent violence from happening in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So having knowledge about sex and reproduction, boundaries and consent helps protect everyone. And we should really start those conversations as early as we can. One last couple of things that I want to talk about before we wrap things up. One, I know you mentioned, Ariel, earlier that some people sort of celebrate Daphne and her taking this power back. But should we celebrate that? And why not? And are we still allowed to like Daphne and Simon as a couple, or do we have to hate Bridgerton and stop watching it?
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up kind of how Daphne is framed throughout the show. I really struggled to identify what message the show was trying to send about Daphne, because certainly I saw her as a character who was very naive, but also very self-pitying, very selfish. She didn't really take the feelings of others into account. She saw herself as a victim in every single situation. And, I wouldn't personally say that's someone worth celebrating, or those actions are worth celebrating at all. I'm not too sure what the show wanted to kind of portray with the actions that she was taking. It does seem like they were wanting to portray the actions she was taking because they led to them kind of resolving Simon's childhood trauma, as if that's so easy, and him changing his mind and then being a beautiful, happy family, which of course should be everyone's goal, right? Yeah. And
Yeah.
are we allowed to like Daphne? Well, that's kind of hard to answer,
Yeah.
shows, characters, even people all have flaws, all have complicated histories. You should certainly be critical of all media you consume, even if you really like it. I think if you do like media, a show or a book, then you should also be the one to know like exactly what you need to criticize about it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, I think, absolutely, like we see her kind of as naive, but sort of as a victim in a lot of ways, but definitely her assault and rape of Simon is not something to celebrate. Um, and if we do like her, I guess what you're saying is like, okay, like everyone can have flaws. Like the TV show itself may have flaws, um, but it's still okay to enjoy it as a show as long as we're critical, right?
Mhm.
Sarah and Leslie, do you have anything to add to that? Any thoughts?
I mean, I agree. I think media literacy is one of those big things that people need to be aware of. I think you can like a show, but I think you also have to know where a show, like Ariel says, has its flaws. That's part of being an informed consumer, is basically knowing and understanding how does this mirror reality and how does this not mirror reality. And you can like the show and you can like the characters, but I think you just always have to be aware of these are things that they have done that are not okay and that you may not like. I think it kind of reminds me of this idea of kind of Breaking Bad, where people were looking up to the main character in Breaking Bad when he did really terrible things. And so I think as long as we're aware of what the show was trying to, what we understand from the show, and we think about the actions and we think about, does that make sense in real life? Does that make sense for me? I think then you can enjoy a show for what it is, but always be aware of kind of what the message underlying is.
And I would just add that I know, for at least me personally, I get very emotional when I watch TV shows. I get really hooked. I get really attached. And I start to feel things that mirror maybe what I've gone through in my life. So I might be more supportive towards one character because they're going through something that I've gone through. And so I think it's important that, you know, these kind of things can also make us check our own biases and be like, okay, if we are seeing these things and we are kind of leaning towards, well, maybe what that happened wasn't that bad, then we could be like, okay, well, why do I think that? And I don't know, I think that kind of thing's kind of fun to just be like, well, what am I really thinking? What's really going on? And just one thing I kind of wanted to throw in there, it's like whether you decide whether you liked the show or did not like the show, I have been so enthralled with these instrumental remixes of popular pop songs they put in there. I just keep listening to them over and over again. So may not like some of the things that the characters do, but will definitely continue to listen to those songs.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree with you all. It's like, okay, we just need to be critical of the things that we watch, read, music we listen to. And as long as we keep having these conversations, I think that's the most important thing. And really, I'm grateful that we have this show to discuss these really, really important topics, sort of from a more entertaining lens. So I'm grateful for it, despite some of the drawbacks that we can see.
And there are so many more topics also that we didn't touch on. I feel like it's important to recognize kind of the racist stereotypes that the show might also be relying on in order to try to excuse Daphne's actions, which is why I brought up perhaps their casting decisions may have played a role in trying to shift perception of that scene. You know, Black men and even Black children are less likely to be seen as victims of crimes, violent crimes, or even assault. So that's certainly worth discussing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen so many good conversations around Bridgerton, and, you know, the depictions of sexual assault and rape, but also their choices to cast a really diverse cast, and what that looks like, what that means. So we love to discuss it. I think we would love to stay here all day and discuss it if we could. There's a billion things to talk about. Maybe we'll have to do more follow-ups in the future. But I think we have to wrap up now. So thank you all so much for joining me. And thank you all to everyone. I had so many people reach out to help and add to the conversation for today's community conversation. So thank you, Kelly, Maya, Taylor, Rachel, Christy, all of you were so helpful. Thank you, Ariel and Leslie and Sarah, for being here today. And we hope to have more conversations like this in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you, Nicole and Sarah, for all the important work you do educating the children. That's really world-changing work.
Well, thank you, Ariel and Leslie, for doing your part at Denton County Friends of the Family and making sure our clients' voices are heard.
Lots of love.
Yes.